Well, the destruction of the Kakhovka dam in Ukraine has caused severe flooding along the Dnipro River and areas near the Black Sea. The region is home to some of the country's most fertile agricultural land, and many farms are threatened by the flooding. DW correspondent Sonia Falnica sent us this report from a village in the Mykolaiv region.
The village of Mykolaiv in southeastern Ukraine. It was bombarded heavily last year by occupying Russian forces, leaving mines and explosives everywhere. Now, sudden flooding has severed power supplies and cut off entire areas. The destruction of the Kakhovka dam has affected places much further away. Here in the Mykolaiv region, a major agricultural area, water levels in the Inhulets River have risen dramatically, and that has had a major impact on farms here. There's only one way to get around the village.
That was our farm. The water smells chemical. It's really bad. There could be dead fish and dogs here. The fields were fertilized and now everything's in the water. The Russians didn't get us, but the floods did.
Ivan's father, Vadim, says many people didn't believe they would be impacted because the dam break occurred nearly 130 kilometers away. No one was prepared. Theirs isn't the only home and farm to be submerged.
Raise your hands if you are affected.
Most of Vadim's 200-hectare fields have disappeared. His barley, sunflower, and wheat are out there somewhere. The bloated Inhulets River has transformed the landscape. The loss of his crops isn't his only worry.
We are hardened farmers. We know what it is to lose everything and start again. I tell you, the ground will be contaminated because of a lot of chemicals, diesel fuel, machine oil. We will have a different kind of tragedy.
It's a major concern for small farmers like Maria Voivodina as well.
We know how much work was involved. We dug and planted this with our own hands. It's all gone in one moment.
The former teacher mainly grows vegetables for her own family. She and her husband Oleg say the sudden floods probably meant many farmers couldn't get their machinery and farm chemicals to dry ground in time.
The skin burns when you get in the water. There must be chemicals in there.
That could affect the 8-meter-deep ground well they use for water.
My biggest concern is that all this water will seep into the ground. And after that, it will be impossible to use this water, not just to drink, but even to wash our clothes. It will be a disaster.
The threat of contamination has alarmed local authorities. This unit was set up in April last year to monitor the impact of the war on the environment. Now the floods are the focus.
In short, it's a nightmare. When this is all over, when the water recedes, in the long term, the situation will get worse. There are places where cemeteries are flooded, and pet cemeteries as well. No one can really say for sure what the consequences could be.
Unknown threats are part of life here. Like so many settlements near the front line, Mykolaiv has suffered waves of tragedy and survived.
I can now talk to Pierre Vautier. He is the head of the UN's Food and Agricultural Organisations branch, FAO, in Ukraine. Thanks for joining us. We saw part of the picture there. More broadly speaking, though, tell us first how seriously this war has affected Ukraine's agricultural sector.
So the war, since the beginning of the full invasion, has had a major impact on the global food security at large, not only for Ukraine, but the global food security in the world due to the restriction to the grain export and the constraint based on that. But also in the production in Ukraine, I mean, the reduction has been very drastic in terms of productions and export. So that's what is the main issue since the beginning of last year on the production for Ukraine. So the farmers are suffering on the fact that they cannot access to the inputs at a normal price. The price has risen, but also for the exporting the grain and exporting the food is becoming also a constraint. So for them, they're earning less, and they are less able to produce also this year, last year, and also again this year. So we recorded a reduction of productions 30% last year, and even a further 30% reduction for this year, which is forecast at the moment.
And just to zoom in a little, how has the destruction of the Nova Kakhovka dam specifically affected the situation?
So the dam was been broken is in the Kherson Oblast. And this oblast, this region, is one of the major agricultural producing regions for Ukraine. So the flood was been unleashed from this Kakhovka dam, flooded in particular the agricultural land, which were close to this area, which is very fertile. And of course, most probably, but it's too early yet to assess the situation, since the water is receding now, it's more likely destroyed the crop which was around the river below the dam. Another element also is, in fact, this dam was very important. It's very important because it's feeding a lot of irrigation scheme. And due to the fact that the level of water go down, they are not, these schemes are not irrigated anymore. And this has also an impact, also not only from this oblast, but also on the neighboring oblast, where in fact they were feeding this irrigation scheme from the retenue.
There's a lot of talk about global food security as a result of this invasion. 16 months after Russia's invasion began, though, how badly is Ukraine's food security affected by this?
No, sorry. So what we saw last year in 2022 is in fact the production of Ukraine drastically reduced, in particular in terms of crop. And Ukraine is a major country feeding the world. A number of countries are depending on the import of the grain from Ukraine because it was on a major producer worldwide. So these elements happen to impact last year the price, and we saw the price rising up due to the fact that Ukraine was not able to provide the production, so to export the productions on one side. Now, thanks to the Black Sea grain initiatives, the export via the Black Sea resumed, and they are still continuing and going on. It's very important that this is maintained, but of course the export is much more complicated than before. So that's one of the elements. The second element is in fact with the war, the price of the petrol, of the fertilizers, of the seeds increased and become more complicated to access for the farmers, in particular the small farmers. So the productions has been reduced because people are planting less, and the harvest are lower. In 2022, there was a reduction compared to 2021 of 30% of the production nationwide, and again this year a further decrease of 30% is expected.
Pierre Vautier, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Antonina Bryaka, an agricultural economist with more than 2 decades of experience in the Ukrainian food sector. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to ask you first about how seriously this war has affected Ukraine's agricultural sector. What has the impact of Russia's invasion been?
Of course, first of all, the Russian invasion to Ukraine affected global food security. And Ukraine was able to produce and export much less than previously. For example, in 2022, Ukraine produced just 13 million tons less of wheat and 15,000 tons less, million tons less of corn compared to 2021. And consequently, in 2022, we exported 11 million tons less of wheat. The export of corn didn't change much due to huge ending stocks that we had from the previous year because the Black Sea ports were blocked. And we exported the same 27 million tons. But this year, we expect to export approximately only 10 million tons of wheat and not more than 19 million tons of corn. And now with the dam destruction, it will be at least 1 million tons of grain less. And this is only under the condition of grain initiative extension.
Yeah. Explain for our viewers who don't know the ins and outs of this, in practical terms, what about the war has been getting in the way of production and that exporting? What does it look like?
So, first of all, a lot of land been damaged, a lot of mines, and also the logistic was interrupted. So even farmers were able to produce, they were not able to ship it. And also the cost of production increased, the price of fuel, price of fertilizers, and access to these inputs as well. So, and of course, up to 22% of our agricultural land is occupied or damaged, so it cannot be usable for agriculture, and this decrease our yields and our harvest.
You mentioned also the Kakhovka Dam. Yeah, I wanted to ask specifically how the destruction of this dam has affected the situation.
This affected really badly agricultural sector. Of course, this is an ecological disaster. This is man-made catastrophe and humanitarian crisis. But talking about agriculture, water washes away the fertile topsoil layer. As for now, approximately 10,000 hectares of agricultural land on the right bank of the Kherson region could be destroyed completely from flood as a result of the Russian terrorist act on the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant, and also several times more on the left bank on the region, which is now under occupation. Totally up to 25,000 hectares of flooded territory will become completely unsuitable for agriculture for at least 5-7 years. But this is only talking about destroyed land. Besides that, irrigation system is destroyed. The disaster interrupted the water supply to 31 field irrigation system in Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson region. In 2021, this system provided irrigation for up to 600,000 hectares, from which we harvested about 4 million tons of grain and oil crops, which worth about $1.5 billion. And now, due to the destruction of the dam, without water, left 94% of irrigation system in Kherson, 74% of Zaporizhia irrigation system, and 30% of Dnipropetrovsk region. And this will cause decrease in yields, of course. For example, if we are talking about oil crops, it will decrease harvest twice. And if we would talk about grains, it would decrease the harvest 2.5 times. It just yields per hectare.
These are really serious numbers. I'm afraid that's all we have time for now, but I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise with us. That's agricultural economist Antonina Bryaka. Many thanks.
Let's bring in Dr. Stefan von Taubadel. He's a professor of agricultural economy and rural development at the University of Göttingen. Professor, how would you describe the consequences for Ukraine's agricultural economy from the Russian invasion and the resulting war on the whole?
The Russian invasion, of course, has had a catastrophic effect on Ukraine's agricultural economy. A few years ago, they were producing over 80 million tons of wheat and grain, and this year they're going to maybe come in somewhere around 50. So there's a lot missing. The recent dam destruction is, in the short run, a terrible thing for people in the area. And as we just heard, it's spreading out. In the longer term, the environmental consequences and the effects on production are also going to be significant.
Can you elaborate on that? How much worse, actually, could the agriculture crisis become following the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam?
I don't think the dam is going to have a huge impact on prices in the short run. We're in a lucky situation, so to speak, although it's kind of difficult to speak of luck in this situation. But in the rest of the world at the moment, the outlooks for production are quite good. North America, Europe, Russia for that matter. Even Ukraine is going to be producing a bit more this year, I think, than people were expecting a few months ago, although this recent destruction, of course, does have an impact. If we look at the global situation, luckily what's missing from Ukraine is being picked up somewhere else. So prices have increased since the dam was destroyed a little bit, but they're not going through the roof, and I don't think they will unless, and this is the big issue, unless we start to get bad production news from somewhere else in the world. We know that the dryness here in Western Europe is becoming an issue in some areas, and it could be that in a few weeks we look a bit differently at that. So it's always a question of what else is happening elsewhere in the world. And luckily, at the moment, other places are sort of picking up some of the slack that Ukraine is missing due to Russia's aggression.
Now, if we're looking at major food importers around the world that actually suffer from the war in Ukraine, what countries are they and why?
Oh, there's a variety of countries. I think the first thing that comes to mind is sort of Northern Africa and Eastern Africa, countries such as Egypt, for example, that are heavily dependent on grain imports and that are also relatively close to the Black Sea region. So it's logical that they tend to get supplied by the Black Sea, Russia and Ukraine. Those are the countries that have certainly hurt the most. For the most part, because they've received assistance and so on, I think they've been able to make the purchases that they need. But the purchases have been much more expensive than they would have been without the war and without the current situation. We used to have grain prices somewhere between maybe $150 and $200 a ton before the Russian invasion. They were already high because of Corona, but they were lower than they are now. And since the invasion, they peaked up at around 400, and they've come down now, but we're still at 240 roughly today when I looked in. And that means a substantial burden on countries that have to purchase grain on world markets. It's a substantial burden for the World Food Program and organizations that provide food assistance because they have to buy it at more expensive prices as well. And a lot of the countries that are affected are countries that are already in dire straits because of the impact of Corona, because they've already spent a lot of money. They're heavily indebted. And they're even less equipped than usual to put a higher food bill.
That was the agricultural economist Stefan von Taubadel joining us from the University of Göttingen. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us here on DW News.
Thank you.